Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I think probably we're starting a bit late out of courtesy to the fact that it might have been a hard schlep for some people to get here today. But I think probably we should get underway, and no doubt people will be trickling in. But and Rob Laidlaw just trickled in. So now that Rob's here, we know it's time to start. My name is Erika Ritter, and I'm interested in animal issues. I'm a writer and often write about them, and have become involved with Animal Alliance, and therefore have had a chance to meet some of the people who are the speakers today. And the event, this whole gathering, really, the idea is not only for people who already work together to catch up with each other on different aspects of their work, but also for people who are looking for inspiration in their own activism, people who are in areas where they're kind of feel they're working alone in these things or don't have a lot of community support. It's great to get the inspiration, especially on a day like this, blah and cold and dead of January, and we really appreciate that everybody made the slog to get here on a day like this. I think you'll think it's worthwhile. And what connects everybody in this room, I'm assuming, is love and concern for animals, but really it's the human cooperation and the mutual encouragement that keeps everybody connected and keeps all these campaigns and campaigners going. And this is particularly true, I think, in the society that we live in, where we think we have such connectivity, with social media and email and Snapchat and everything else. But in fact, communication that's virtual and not actual has its limits. I think it's very good to feel that you can touch base in a day-to-day and kind of face-to-face way with people, and to hear from people who really are on the front lines of a lot of areas of this work, which is the group that we have today. I have to tell you, unfortunately, our fifth speaker was going to be Mike McIntosh, who is very involved in bear rehabilitation and public education about bears. And unfortunately, Mike is up in Algonquin, and for some reason or other, probably weather-related, could not make it today. So there will be 4 speakers, but it's still, there will be ample material here. And the issues range, as you'll find, from protecting captive wildlife to advocating for policy and laws to keep animals out of research, and just generally fostering understanding of animals who, after all, were on this turf before we were, and we don't share very nicely in most cases. There's the assembly of people in this room is, I think, more impressive and twice as valuable as the entire collection in the Jewel House at the Tower of London. So you've saved yourself a trip. This is where it's at. And we're going to have each speaker come up individually and give a presentation. And following each, there will be an opportunity after each speaker to ask questions. But my job is to kind of keep things moving so that we're really roughly talking about a half an hour in total for each of the speakers, which would be 15 or 20 minutes of presentation and then about 10 minutes for questions. So if I hustle you off, be aware that afterward there will be ample opportunity for meet and greet, and nosh and natter. We'll have some light food, vegan food, and there'll be chances to talk to people if you don't get a chance to pose your individual question. But Leah Lascaris is going to be passing among you with a microphone after each speaker. So if you want to ask a question, just signal your intention, and she'll come over or have it passed to you. So let's get started, and I think we're going to begin very logically, to me, at the beginning, which is with Liz White, who I think for a lot of us, myself included, is kind of an entry point into the whole world of interrelated animal organizations. She is really a linchpin of a lot of organizations. She's been an advocate from the beginning of her career, first as a registered nurse, and then working for the disadvantaged, working on Aboriginal land settlements. But for the past 3 decades, her focus has been the animals and the environment that we all share. She's a founder of the Animal Alliance and the Animal Protection Party, which she's going to talk more about today. I met Liz when she was a candidate for the Animal Protection Party during a federal election campaign, and I was interviewing her for a book I was doing on human-animal relationships. So she invited me to come along door knocking with her, and she went out canvassing. And as you can imagine, if you know Liz, she's a dynamo at the door. She's articulate, approachable, knowledgeable, warm. Nobody turned her away, even if they weren't going to vote for that party or any party like it. And she's also very humane, because we walk door to door, and I have a bad ankle, and Liz insisted on driving me home from this, and she personally, I think, could have walked all of Toronto knocking on doors, but she cut it short for me. And I feel she's been sort of chauffeuring me ever since to a wider understanding of the network of animal protectors and their relationships to each other. And this, as I say, spans here and around the world, and Liz is going to talk about that too. Here's Liz White.
Okay, sorry guys, I'm just going to move that around a bit. Well, thank you so much for coming. We actually decided to do this. We have a Christmas party every year, but we decided this year not to have a Christmas party and instead to do this. And I think actually this is a lot more interesting. We have more people here, and we'll have lots of opportunity to talk about all kinds of issues. So, sorry, taped to the floor. Sorry. Sorry. Very classy. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the politics of people, animals, and the environment. So last June, Jordan, who is our West Coast campaigner, and I attended a conference about farm animal transport in the Netherlands, and it was held by a group called Animal Politics Foundation. It is a foundation that was set up by a political party in the Netherlands called Party for the Animals. And both the party and the foundation, interestingly, are dedicated to enshrining rights of animals into the democratic process worldwide. It's a pretty lofty goal, in my opinion. The Party for the Animals describes itself as the first political party in the world that does not put short-term interests of man in the pivotal position, but the entire planet and all her inhabitants instead. So clearly this would be perceived as a party that was radical. Some may even say extreme. So the question is, how successful has it been? Well, in November 2006, the Party for the Animals elected 2 people out of 150 seats in the Dutch lower house. That's like our parliament. In 2015, the party elected a total of 50 representatives, 2 in the lower house, 2 in the upper house, 1 in the European Parliament, 18 representatives in 10 provincial states, 12 representatives in 12 cities, and 15 representatives in 8 Dutch water councils. That is from top to bottom, they have elected officials. And then in 2017, they won an additional 3 seats in the lower house, so that made up a total of 5. Both Jordan and I left that conference inspired. We met animal rights people who understood the critical role that politics plays in protecting life on Earth. We met people from 22 countries, people who were actively engaged in politics, many of whom had established animal rights political parties, some of whom were actually elected at various levels of government. And so real political change was beginning to take hold in the Netherlands. It was really inspiring. It was actually amazing. So the question is, how do we in Canada build on what we learned in the Netherlands, but within the Canadian context? Because of course we have constraints under the first past the post voting system. It's a much regressive kind of voting process. But there's desire, real desire, I think, for political change that we're seeing expressed in places like the Democratic nomination with Bernie Sanders, with the election of the 28-year-old Democrat who defeated a 10-term Republican incumbent in New York. There are many, many examples of people who are inspired to have change. So how do we, who want to protect animals and the environment, tap into desire for real change in our country? In the past and present, We have been forced to go hat in hand, begging politicians and governments and their bureaucracies to end animal cruelty and change the laws and end the suffering. Often we've been dismissed, and even when we have evidence on our side. But despite all the hurdles, we've actually had victories. We've won protection for animals. Animal Alliance and the Animal Protection Party has had some stunning successes, as has many organizations and individuals in this room who are working on similar issues. I'll just give you a quick list of 5 that are sort of a national example. We won a Canada-wide ban on the transport of compromised animals to slaughter. That remains in place today. We ended an Ontario Parks cormorant cull. We forced the University of Guelph to end the practice of live terminal surgeries, killing cats and dogs after they've been spayed and neutered by veterinary students. We stopped a number of deer culls in BC and Ontario, and we successfully intervened in the Supreme Court with Zoocheck and lawyers Lesli, Bisgould and Clay Ruby to prevent the patenting of life form, namely the oncomouse. So these victories are possible, and our victories are probable and even likely. And we should continue to fight those fights. They're very, very important. But I think we just need to recognize that the fight for fundamental change in our society requires us to be more politically engaged. We hear about the failure of young people to vote, and we worry about low voter turnout, and I don't blame anybody for this, have become extremely cynical about politics and politicians. When you watch Donald Trump and Doug Ford, there's every reason to be cynical. But I think we need to overcome our cynicism in order to make lasting change for animals and for all life forms on Earth through political discourse. Animal Alliance has always been a nonprofit advocacy group because of the extent of our political and electoral work. 10 years after the organization was founded, we conducted a 10-year review and concluded that despite amazing victories and animals saved, we needed to step up our game. What we had to achieve so far was good, but not good enough. So we formed an entity called Environment Voters. This is back in the time when it was much harder to form a political party. And it operated between 1999 and 2006 and participated in third-party activity in federal, provincial, and municipal elections all across the country. And I'll just use one example. We entered a fight in the city of Winnipeg, who had a contract with the University of Manitoba to sell all their dogs to research. And we attempted to meet with the mayor and city council and others, and they refused to change that legislation. So ultimately, after a year-and-a-half fight, we entered the municipal politics. Glenn Murray was the mayor at the time. Glenn Murray used to be a cabinet minister under Wynne government. And so we entered into the game. We supported candidates and went out and canvassed, put out literature for the candidates who wanted the practice to end. We ran radio ads against the mayor. If Mayor Glenn Murray can't even run a dog pound, what makes you think he can run a city? 3 weeks after the election ended, the mayor and council were so inundated with opposition from residents that they canceled the contract at the university, and that stands today. So we know electoral processes and electoral politics can work for real change for animals and the environment. But despite our involvement as a third party, we had serious constraints under the election laws. In many places, they were narrowing down what third parties could do. And then amazingly, in 2003, the federal political landscape changed, thanks, interestingly, to the Communist Party of Canada. The party, and it's the second oldest party in Canada next to the Liberals, very interesting party, waged a 13-year legal battle with the federal government for its survival. It had been deregistered for failing to run the required 50 candidates in the election. However, took the thing to the Supreme Court, and in Figueroa versus Canada, the court struck down the 50% minimum as being unconstitutional, and the federal government was forced to amend the Canada Elections Act and allow political parties to become registered, provided, after a number of other requirements, provided they run one candidate. So all of a sudden, this world of politics was opened up to people who wanted to do this kind of work. And then thanks to Stephen Best, who's our advisor and chief agent, he suggested that we consider forming the first ever animal protection party in Canada. He suggested that we reach out to our supporters to determine whether there was any interest in it. And in fact, our supporters embraced the idea. And so the Animal Protection Party of Canada was born and formally registered in December 2005. And so now we were able to fully participate in federal election campaigns. We then developed a platform, a number of strategies to build our campaigns on, and I just thought I'd go over a few of those strategies just to give you an idea. The idea is in campaigns of any sort, electoral or otherwise, because of the magnitude of the issues that we deal with, the large numbers, 750 million animals we eat every year, not us, others. 3.6 million research animals is just too hard for people to get their head around. What does that mean? What animals are we talking about? Killing 50 cormorants a day, that sort of thing. So the idea is to identify an animal and make that animal kind of the ambassador for the issue. And the same for habitat. We need to identify key habitats and make them sort of highlight the need for broad protections, because it's hard to comprehend the extent of industrial exploitation of land and resources in Canada. We need to really research each issue. Our research is evidence-based. It's important to never believe the animal exploiters or never believe the government agencies that defend those animal and environmental exploiters. And we need to examine and critique information and challenge claims like deer are destroying the environment, cormorants are causing ecological damage. We need to figure out how to deal with those kinds of issues. We need to develop a coherent strategy. We need to never give up. There are lots of issues that are easy to win, but most of the issues are not. And we need to always be there to say we are never going to give up. And that makes us really a very strong, formidable force against the interests that are not ours. And then we need to engage in politics between and during elections. And like it or not, it's ultimately necessary because it's the only way to affect long-term change for animals and the environment. Politicians are the gatekeepers of the legislation. They decide what animals live and die, what level of cruelty and suffering is acceptable, what exploitation is necessary for human entertainment and progress. With over 50 elected representatives at all levels of government, the Party for the Animals in the Netherlands provides a constant pressure to move forward on the agenda to protect animals, not backward. So how do we start? How do we begin to achieve what the Party for the Animals has been able to achieve? We have a much more challenging job because we have a first past the post system. So we just need to figure out how to affect change. So we need to acknowledge and embrace electoral politics and understand the importance of our participation in it. And we need to develop election campaign expertise at all levels of government. We need political researchers and strategists, those who exist in major political parties, who will lay out a strategic plan for electoral involvement and ways to change political composition so that governments become more responsive to us and to our interests in terms of animal protection and the environment. We're suggesting for those people who don't want to be candidates, and if anybody's decided after this talk that they'd love to be a candidate, come on up and see me afterwards. For those who don't want to, we're looking for people to run what we call riding watch. And those are participants in their own ridings. And what we're looking for are people who will be responsible for researching the riding, who the candidates are, what's the voting history, and for people to keep tabs during the election on the candidates, on public events, on all candidates meetings, and to have animal protection people there at every single all candidates meeting, asking every single candidate, what are you going to do to protect animals and the environment? And can you imagine if at every all candidates meeting in 338 ridings across this country that happened? That would be a national discussion. We would have some degree of control over the debate, and I think we would see some interesting change that might come out of that. We have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all kinds of social avenues that we've never had before, that we can actually build a national commentary if people decided that they wanted to take this on. We need to fight the first past the post system, obviously, but that's a long-term goal. We need to campaign for minority governments because under the first past the post system, they work better for us. If everybody has to talk to each other to get a piece of law passed, it tends to be a better piece of law. The idea is to demonstrate at the end of the day that political parties, that there are consequences for positions taken on animal protection and environmental issues. And those consequences can be positive and they can be negative. So without serious political involvement, we will continue to see the demise of such bills as 246 and S214. We will see amendments to animal transport regulations continually undermined and weakened. We will continue to fail to meet our climate change targets. We will continue to deny the main causes of a climate change, such as intensive animal agriculture. We will continue to be a throwaway society whose economy is built on ever-increasing consumption, clearly not sustainable. We will continue to go hat in hand and beg for change, and we will face a dismissive and arrogant Trudeau who could not even pass the most minimal changes to the criminal code section. And we will face a Ford government who seems intent on encroaching on protected areas and facilitating the destruction of double-crested cormorants. We have a real opportunity to acquire power. The Animal Protection Party has been in existence since 2006 and is the only animal rights party in Canada. We have an incredible opportunity at the time when voters are deciding who they're going to vote for and how they're going to vote. And we're at a time when candidates are asking for their job back. This is more time when people are listening to what we have to say. We can run candidates, spend money, run national ads. We have all sorts of potential to begin to change the dialogue in politics in Canada. I think we should stop begging, and I think we should become political. We should acquire sufficient political power and demand real legislative change that will protect animals and the environment in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And now there will be an opportunity not only to sign up to be a candidate later, but right now to ask questions generally to Liz. And if you signal who you are, where you are, then Leah will come with the microphone. Who's got a question? I'm sure there are some. Yes, ma'am. Did you hear that question? Because it's the opinion about the new Canada Food Guide.
I think it's gone amazingly in the right direction. This is a time when industry, the Trudeau government has, the animal agriculture industry has great access to the politicians. But surprisingly, Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor and previous ministers have put a wall between the people who are making the decision about what the food guide should look like and the lobbyists. So they were never able to lobby who was deciding what was in the food guide, and I think we see the correct results from that. And that is a move to plant-based diets and away from animal-based proteins. I think it's fabulous.
The other thing I noticed is that when news people are talking about it, they're not talking about it as like a wild, off the mainstream kind of new thing. They're talking about it as if this is what we have to do.
Yeah.
So it's really the message is getting out there to people, and this is the new reality.
The fact is, it is what we have to do in order to save our climate.
Yeah.
Even from a self-interested perspective, animal agriculture is the significant greatest contributor to global warming and greenhouse gases, and governments are simply oblivious to that fact or certainly don't want to deal with it. So the fact that the food guide did deal with that is really I think it's an amazing thing that it actually got achieved. Yeah.
Kind of miraculous.
Yeah. Yeah. Julie?
Can you just wait till she gets there with the mic so that everybody can hear?
I would like to know with cat and dog shelters, right now, is OSPCA, Toronto Humane Society Animal Services, do they actually give animals to labs? And 'cause people have asked this question, and I wasn't sure, how do we know which shelters are, actually giving animals to lab testing and which ones aren't?
Most of the larger municipalities that we know are not. Toronto Animal Services, when they were amalgamated back in, can't remember the date, but when the city was amalgamated, there was actually a formal motion at council that agreed that animals would not go to research. So we know, and we've surveyed a number of other municipalities to get that considered or to confirmed. However, there are 440 municipalities in Ontario, a number of them which don't have dog and cat bylaws at all, a number of them which only have dog bylaws, and very little information about what happens to the animals. And we're in fact dealing with a dog that was lost up in around Lake Simcoe, and he's just disappeared. And nobody can, and he's a big distinctive dog, like big, his large dog, black and white. And he just disappeared within like a short period of time, just gone. And despite all of the calls to the pound and to the municipality and to others, it is unclear what happened to him. So we don't know. So we're working on that, but there's no requirement for pounds to tell you. It's pretty sad stuff. Good. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Yep. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
To ask a question regarding the cormorant situation. Has anything, an outcome being brought forward by the government as yet? What is their decision?
Just for people who don't know, the provincial government posted on the environmental registry a proposal to manage double-crested cormorants. These are birds that by all, I mean, we don't eat animals, but for people who do, are inedible because they're fish-eating birds, and yet they are going to now be, the government is proposing to declare them as a game bird, to allow people holding a small game permit to kill 50 birds a day from the middle of March until the end of December. So every day, all year. And I did a little bit of research, and there's almost 200,000 people holding small game permits. So what we have is a proposal to exterminate a native water bird that has been subject of intense persecution for hundreds of years, and in fact was driven to near extinction because of persecution before it was then again driven to near extinction because of DDT. So we've been opposing it, and many people, and maybe some in the room, have written in opposition. The government has not made a decision yet, we haven't seen it, but their intention is to have something up and running by mid-March. So it's kind of frightening as to actually what's going to happen. We don't, but there's been no decision made as yet. Yeah.
I was just wondering, which organization protects livestock or horses in particular? It doesn't sound like the OSPCA is doing a good job or scaling back its efforts, but there seems to be a lot of animal abuse in terms of the equine industry, and who's responsible for ensuring their welfare?
Well, originally it was under the contract. I think it was the OSPCA. Where that falls now, I don't know. I suspect maybe some of the inspectors within OMAFRA, but I don't think that's at all clear, and I don't think the government has been clear about that. I think that there is real problems with the delivery of animal welfare law enforcement by a private entity. Animal Alliance and Zoocheck have come together to write a report called New Directions to talk about alternatives to the animal welfare law enforcement delivery system in Ontario, and we're recommending that it be taken back as a government project. It is a public service and not to be paid for by a private entity. The government gives the OSPCA $5.5 million, but it costs them $20 million to do law enforcement, animal welfare law enforcement in Ontario. So people, donors like you and me and whomever else, money goes to pay for what is actually, should be a public service with access to freedom of information and accountability and transparency. So that's what our report actually deals with. But I think we're going to be in a situation where things are going to be in flux for some time with the OSPCA and the law enforcement issue, just because there's significant changes in the government and significant changes, I think, within the OSPCA, but whether they actually want to do this or not. So we'll see where it goes. At any rate, we're going to be lobbying to see if we can get our report on the agenda for the Conservatives and see if we can get it considered as an alternative.
Just wondering what your thoughts are on ending the or how do we get the government to end subsidies to the meat and dairy industry and maybe potentially direct them over to the plant industry. A bunch of us went to Ottawa last year. We marched Nations Rising, which is a march to end government subsidies, but that's clearly not enough.
Right. Well, that's what I mean. Clearly, that particular issue is exactly what I'm speaking with about the party. We need to figure out a way to build that commentary in a much more broad way in the ridings, in people of the parties where people make decisions about giving $25 million to the dairy industry to promote milk drinking, and all the other subsidies that take place. And I think that's actually, you can't legislate somebody being vegan. I mean, that's not going to happen in a democracy. But you can say, we are not going to subsidize any animal agriculture at all. We are going to begin to focus our subsidies on alternatives, on plant-based stuff. And we're going to push, as the Food Guide does and others, behavior, changes in behavior, along with people in the health industry, so that it's a multifaceted focus on trying to get people to change their behavior. But I think you have to do it through taxation and other legitimate kinds of democratic tools to actually begin to change people's behavior.
I actually have a note to speak on that. I do have a petition with me today on behalf of Nation Rising, and one of our asks is ending animal agriculture subsidies and transitioning farmers to plant-based agriculture. I will be delivering this to Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, who is a vegan MP, and he has agreed to read it in the House of Commons.
Excellent.
So that's one part of the step.
Good. Good. Okay, done.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Liz. And as I said, afterward, when we're finished with all four speakers, there will be opportunities if you have other specific questions. I mean, Liz, as you can tell, really can cover the waterfront. She has many topics. And some of the things that she brought up will be brought up more by subsequent speakers, issues about animals and research, about pets lost to research, and also the report that Liz mentioned that she and Rob have worked on to attempt to bring animal protection back into the public sector. And I think Rob will have some mention to make of that. I first met Rob Laidlaw, who is our next speaker, in a small town Ontario library, and he'd come to offer some insight about a nearby family-run zoo that was a problem. Rob, no doubt, does not remember this evening because it was one of thousands that he would have gone and attended and spoken at. But I remember it because I was struck by the fact this is the founder of Zoocheck. He's a chartered biologist with decades of experience working in animal protection. He's worked all over the world. He's written numerous books for children on animal protection and welfare. And yet that night he'd taken the time to drive out to Prince Edward County from Toronto, or maybe he rode his bike. Rob is a prodigious bike rider. It's only 100 clicks each way. He might have gone on his bike. And he is a very passionate cyclist, but even more passionate about relationships among the entire animal protection sector, which is also something Liz touched on, the need for cooperative work amongst people with these interests and organizations with these interests, and what needs to be done better in order to organize advocates, to lobby politicians, and to improve laws for animals. So let's hear more about this from Rob Laidlaw.
Whenever you're a speaker at one of these events, it's always a challenge to say something that you think is meaningful and is going to be meaningful to the people who attend. And I know that as speakers, we all want to say something that resonates with you, the audience. And we also want to say something that's interesting, informative, and for some of us, hopefully entertaining and funny. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't. I didn't know what I was going to talk about today until this morning. I was sort of struggling with what can I say that's meaningful? I hope it is meaningful, so the title of my talk is called Hopefully Something Meaningful. And I guess time will tell. I really like to change it up when I speak. I don't have any sort of stock speeches that I give, and even if I'm talking about the same topic 5 days in a row, I'll change it up each day because I can't stand listening to myself repeat the same things over and over again, and I'm sure people who attend multiple talks can't either. So I like to switch it up and make it interesting. So I wanted to talk today a little bit about something that I haven't really talked about very much ever before. So hopefully it works. And what I wanted to do is tell you a little bit about what it was like when I started, which in 3 months will be 40 years ago. Never would have believed that. A little bit about my observations of what things are like now, some of the things that have discouraged me over the years, and some of the things that encourage me, and then a little bit about how we might be able to make this movement a little bit better, a little bit more effective for animals, and hopefully for other sectors as well, like the environment and for people as well. So I started out 40 years ago, and it's really interesting because you never think of yourself as being in something this long or as getting old. And I remember being in the office a couple of years ago with my colleague Julie Woodyer, who some of you may know, and we have interns come in every year and work for us, and you know, they're always 18 or 20 or 22 years old, and one of them had referred to us as the elders. And Julie in particular didn't know whether to slap her or to say, gee, thank you very much, because it obviously means lots of wisdom and experience. We don't know if it just meant old or whether it meant something more positive than that, but neither of us liked it. I realized how old I was when I was attending a meeting at World Animal Protection a few years ago, and I said, oh, I remember talking to this policymaker about this issue in such and such a year, and this is what they said, and it was stalled then, and maybe we can learn from it. And 2 of the adult participants in the meeting put their hands up and said, we weren't born yet. Said, holy mackerel. It's been a while. But you never realize it. It just sort of catches up on you. Now, when I started, it was kind of interesting. And the exercise of looking back and thinking about when I started was interesting to me personally, but I think it's interesting when you talk about it to others as well, because back when I started, I wanted to get involved in animal issues, but there were no groups. I could not find any sort of traditional advocacy groups out there that worked on policy making and changing laws and doing investigations and things like that. They didn't exist. I attended the meeting of one group that was the only one that I could find that was advertised as an advocacy group, went to their meeting, nothing against people who are elderly, but I think the youngest person was about 75 or 80. And the primary item on the agenda for the evening was whether to have a popcorn popper at the upcoming bazaar. That was the state of things way back then. There were few groups, even in the US, other than a sort of a handful of groups that had started in the 40s and 50s, there weren't very many. There weren't any individuals that I could find. We didn't have the internet or Facebook back then, so it was very difficult to find people, but you know, the meetings I attended and the efforts I made to find people were largely unsuccessful. There wasn't a lot of acceptance of a lot of the issues that today are quite well accepted and talked about in a very serious way, and there was not a lot of awareness. To a large extent, the animal stuff was fringe. You know, people thought it was sort of, hey, you know, some people over there that are crazy cat ladies and a few others are interested in these issues, but nobody else is. They were fringe issues very much. There was very little information about what was going on in the world. I remember having to actually write letters and put stamps on them and mail away to England and to Germany and other places that had a longer established movement for animal protection to actually find out what was going on, because there were no sources of information. And of course you had to wait 2 or 3 months or sometimes longer to get a reply to find out what was going on. And then of course you had 20 other questions, and then off goes another letter. And it was a very laborious and long-term kind of process. And of course we didn't have any of the technologies that were available today that make effective advocacy possible. I remember my big technological innovation. This was something I thought was amazing. It was like moving into the era of Star Trek. I got a $69 electric typewriter. And that was the big technological innovation. And then after that, it was a fax machine. We thought we were in the space age, because prior to the fax machine being acquired, we actually drove around Toronto from about midnight till 5 a.m. hand delivering press releases, putting them in mailbox, sliding them under doors, and doing things like that to disseminate the information. So that was the state of things back then. Not very many people, very minimal technology, not a lot of interest or acceptance. But from about 1980 to 1992, and I started doing this work in 1979, from about 1980 to 1992, there was a flurry of activity that most people don't know about. A lot of groups started at that time, or in that time period. Zoocheck started in 1984. The Toronto Humane Society at the time had a vibrant and quite large advocacy department, which some of the people in this room actually worked for. And that department was renowned throughout North America and around the world for being this very progressive and action-oriented entity. When the Toronto Humane disbanded that aspect of their organization, Animal Alliance formed. I think it was in 1992. 1990, okay, so even earlier. And then other groups started forming as well. In 1982, prior to the formation of Zoocheck, I was part of a group called Mobilization for Animals that had come up from the US and had established itself in Toronto and had actually gone from about 0 to 8,000 supporters in 8 months. There were quite a number of groups that had started up during that time period, as well as in the US. People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals started. The Performing Animal Welfare Society started. There were a number of groups that were sort of in an analogous situation in the US in terms of the growth of the movement. So it was a really dynamic time, and of course there was more information. There were more books and articles and documentary films coming out as well. I remember back in the 80s with Mobilization for Animals, we were doing events every single week. Our monthly meetings had 200 people attending every single month, and we had about 120 of those people involved in community organizing, broken into groups that worked on logistical matters and outreach and political advocacy and all of that. We had events, some of them that attracted several thousand people. It was a really dynamic time, and there was a lot going on, and it was a very hopeful time. But after about 1992, there were groups like Animal Alliance, like Zoocheck, and a few others, and individuals that sort of slogged on. But then the conversation amongst ourselves became, why are there no new people? Why is this energy and this enthusiasm that we had witnessed previously not taken hold and created this more massive and more vibrant and more effective movement? And unfortunately, it didn't. So we slogged along, and like Liz said, we've all made some fantastic moves forward, some great successes for animals, but the broader movement just didn't materialize. Now that changed to a certain extent with the advent of the internet, because the internet basically was the game changer. And today, because of the internet and other factors, we have literally thousands of groups in North America. I think the last survey that I saw said there were about 11,000 groups in North America that would characterize themselves as animal welfare, animal rights, animal protection groups. And then you've got all kinds of other groups that promote veganism and other issues that have an animal component. So today we have quite a substantial movement. I think there was a survey done a few years ago that said about 10 million citizens in the United States say that they are members of animal rights groups. So that's a sea change from 40 years ago. There's also hundreds of sanctuaries and rescues that have started up dealing with everything from domesticated animals to dogs to wild animals. And they keep growing. They're growing exponentially in numbers. And there's countless events right across the country and across the continent and overseas. Every single week here in Toronto, there's events that have to do with animals or veganism. And if you look across the country, you look elsewhere, you'll see that if you wanted to attend them all, you couldn't. There are just too many. It would be impossible for one person to do that, yet in the old days, you could. You could go to every animal event on the continent. It was quite easy because there weren't very many. There's more mainstream acceptance and interest and more media interest. 20 years ago, with the media, it was like with being in the political arena. These were fringe issues, but now, everywhere in Canada, when we approach media, we don't find them treating these issues as fringe issues. They treat them as deadly serious, and I know Animal Alliance has done the same, and we've done it. We've cultivated media right across the country that want more information, want to get involved in these issues, and for many of them who do opinion columns and other things like that, where they're allowed to voice their own views, they have actually become advocates for animals. So no longer are these issues fringe in the media. And we don't find them to be fringe issues politically as well. Certainly not at municipal level, maybe a little less so at the provincial or federal level, but even at those levels we find that while we don't see the political movement we would like, there still is a lot of interest, a lot of people taking these issues very seriously. That is very, very different. And of course, as I said, the technology that allows greater reach, instantaneous reporting on issues, and an ability to network and cooperate that never existed previously is now there on every home computer. It is so different now than it was 40 years ago. It's almost beyond belief. Now, that would seemingly bode well for everything, that we should have this massive movement that is more effective with each passing year because we've got the tools and we've got the people. But that's not necessarily been the case. And that's one of the things that really, really discourages me, because I think we have the potential to do so much more. You know, so while the interest, awareness, and numbers have skyrocketed, some other aspects of this movement just haven't come to fruition. And one of them is cooperation. And I've seen a lot of sort of groups and individuals going off in different directions in recent years. In the past, and I'm talking in the 80s and 90s and before that, all of the groups tended to focus on things and band together and cooperate and help each other. But today, I think, and it may partially be due to the numbers involved, but I think there's been a lot of people going off in different directions and not supporting each other. And I think that if we want to be effective, especially as Liz said, be an effective political force, that we have to cooperate more and we have to unify far more than we are now. I don't know, because I'm guilty of this too, I don't know what a lot of groups now are doing, and I should. And I'm sure that a lot of other groups and people out there don't know what we're doing, groups like Animal Alliance and Zoocheck. So I think there's a desperate need to cooperate more and to unify to some degree, because it's that old saying, together we're stronger, together we will be stronger. Now, with all those people and these resources, this networking, the Twitter and Instagram and all that, there's a greater number of activities. As I said, you could never go to them all if you wanted to. And unfortunately, a lot of people, they don't really understand how change works. but they have a lot of enthusiasm. They're very motivated. They want to help. They want to get active. And we get hundreds, if not thousands, of events that are occurring that occur outside the context of a larger strategic campaign. So they're isolated events that they're nice events, and you know, maybe a few people learn something, but they don't really have a strategic purpose. And I think that we have to become aware of that, and we have to become better at using our events to achieve change, because with only a very few exceptions, this sort of proverbial making noise, you know, attracting attention to an issue, isn't going to achieve anything. Almost every event and activity should be tied into achieving a very specific strategic goal. And I think all of us, and particularly the people that are protesting all the time, and I'm in favor of protests, absolutely, they're a wonderful change vehicle, but I think every activity that's done has to be tied into specific strategic goals, or else you're not achieving anything except maybe feeling better or getting into some type of social situation where you're with your friends who think the same. I also think that when we're looking at protests and events, we've seen lots of them, like the congregations of people who would collect down in front of Marineland in Niagara Falls and chant and, you know, try to make a ruckus and attract attention and turn away customers to the marine park. And then the protest would dissolve and people would go to a vegan restaurant, or they'd go home and they'd just go about their business. I think there's, on many of these events like that, these failed opportunities. Because if you look at other movements and how they've survived and how they've prospered and how they've become effective, you see that when they get events and protests and these other vehicles in which you have large numbers of people assembled, they use those events as a platform for community organizing. So they don't just say, hey, let's make a few speeches, let's have a few banners, let's chant, sing, do those normal things that you do at these types of events, and then we all go home. They say, let's capitalize on that energy, that collective drive that people get, that motivation that people get when they're at these things. Let's capitalize on it and get all those people right after the event down to a hall or to a hotel room, and let's talk about how do we organize, how do we take all this energy and actually use it to make change happen. And a lot of that will be working on matters that are political in nature. And that's something that has been a failed opportunity with so many protests in Canada, not using the fact that you've got all these interested, motivated people at a place to get them somewhere and get them doing community organizing. That has to change. And we all have some level of blame in how things are developed, and I include myself in that. I think that my own group, and I'll just speak for Zoocheck alone, I think that over the years we haven't made a strong enough attempt to reach out to other groups that do protests and that, to say, you know, how can we become a more unified force? How can we capitalize on what you're doing, and how can you capitalize or learn from what we're doing? I think we have to do a better job at that. I think we who work largely on political initiatives have to do a better job of letting the other people involved in this movement understand what we're doing. Because I have a lot of people that say, oh, I've heard of Zoocheck, or I've heard of this campaign or that campaign, but I don't really know what you do or how you do it. I think we have to do a better job in letting people out there, because not everybody wants to do what we're doing or can do it, but I think there's probably a proportion of people out there that say, I like doing this and I like doing that, but it's not enough, or maybe my skills are better used over in this other direction. So I think we who are doing more of the political advocacy side of things have to really let people know what we're doing, so that they can decide if they want to get involved in that, either independently of us or with us. And one of the things that we're discussing now, and we've been discussing for the past 2 years to try to get past that impasse, is Animal Alliance and ourselves are going to do an activist school. We've been talking about it, I think, for about 3 years, and we will be getting that off the ground this year to try to bridge that gap. We know how to do some things. We don't have all the answers, but we've both had a lot of success, and we think that what we can relate to people and instruct people on will be helpful to them. So, how do we proceed? I've talked a little bit about a few ideas, but how do we proceed? Well, I'm going to give you a few points that came to me this morning. Number one, we have to take advantage of or create opportunities to cooperate and unify. I don't think many of us have really done that, or at least not in an organized, intelligent way that we should. So we have to take advantage of and create opportunities to cooperate and to unify. Number two, we have to learn from each other and from other effective modern movements as well as historical movements. A lot of the way that people operate today with protesting and all that, they're looking back at the civil rights movement or the anti-slavery movements and things like that, and there are tremendous lessons to be learned. But I think we also have to look at what was learned from the more modern movements, what was learned from the indivisible movement, fighting the Trump agenda, what was learned from the Occupy movement. We have to look at modern movements as well, not just historical movements, because if you base everything on what was learned back in the 19th century, it may not work today. So we have to learn from movements and from other sectors that are involved in movements: environmental, affordable housing, poverty relief, etc. Number three, I've mentioned it already, we have to become more strategic. And that means we have to realize that isolated events rarely, if ever, achieve the kind of change that we want. All events and all activities should be part of larger strategic initiatives. Number four, we have to make sure that every event that we do and every assembly of people has a community organizing component. Critically important. That's what you see in other successful modern movements. Number five, we have to have the courage to admit that when something isn't working, we have to have the courage to admit when something isn't working. A lot of us can't do that. We do a protest and we convince ourselves that, hey, that was effective, when in fact it wasn't. A lot of the things I do, I sit back and I say, was that useful? Should I have done it? Could I have done something better? We have to do more of this self-reflection and self-analysis so that we get better. And we don't just keep doing the same things over and over and over again and expecting them to get a result that will never happen. So we have to look at that and not convince ourselves that something that doesn't work does. Number six, as a movement, we have to reach out and find a way to connect and involve other kinds of groups that we may not have tried to cultivate previously. And I think one of them is religious groups. Now, I'm a diehard atheist, but I think it's critically important that we try to connect with religious groups, organized religious groups. They have the numbers, they have the organizational power, and in many cases they have the political clout. And I know George Monbiot, who a polemicist out of England, he writes a column that hundreds of thousands of people read every week. He said that it's crazy that, he was talking about the environmental movement people, that they hadn't joined with the people in the religious side of things. Because, and he used an example in the United States where I think it was the 5 largest environmental organizations in the United States were doing a climate change rally on Capitol Hill in Washington. And they collectively, I think, got 20,000 people out to this event, which had been the biggest event at that time to try to address climate change. And George Monbiot said, well, there are single churches in the United States that get that greater numbers of people every Saturday and every Sunday, and during the week as well. And that's just one church, but there are hundreds and thousands of churches like that that bring these masses and masses of people. And many of them are socially conscious. They are interested in environmental issues. They are interested in animal issues. They are interested, obviously, in poverty relief and disease and all those other things. There are people, large numbers of people in those religious communities that do think like we do, and we have never tapped into them, and we should. And then, of course, as Liz said, and as I said, we have to learn from people in the political arena. If we want to learn how change happens, we have to go to those people or study what they do or become involved in what they do so that we learn experientially. We have to learn from the political arena, and if we don't, we'll only ever get little tiny changes. You know, sure, they're important for animals, but the big changes that we want just won't happen. Now, I just want to finish off with one sort of random idea that came to me this morning, actually at about 11:25 before I hopped in the car to come over here. And I'm always thinking about how do we get people more involved? How do we get people motivated? How do we get people thinking, you know, in a way where they're not complacent, where they just say, okay, I'm going to get up and do something. And one of the things that we found at Zoocheck, and I'm sure it's the same at Animal Alliance, and it's the same at many other groups, is that, you know, we have some of the know-how, but we don't have the numbers. You know, we don't have the thousands and thousands of people that instantly respond to everything we do. And I was trying to think, well, how could we get some of these people involved in some of these things? And the idea I came up with this morning was what I call peer pressure action groups. I thought, why don't we, as a community, get people to sign up to basically an activist list where everything is public. So everybody on that list, anybody can go to the internet and see who's on that list, and then have a checklist of columns. So it could be an important committee meeting coming up at the City of Toronto. It could be some initiative to help agricultural animals in transport. It could be something, all of them geared toward things that have a particular specific goal in mind. And we ask people on that list, and they can opt in or opt off of the list if they want to, hopefully they would stay in, to let people know by checking what they've done. Have they written a letter? Have they contacted their politician? Have they attended a committee meeting? And use peer pressure to try to get more people to get involved, because I think there's a lot of people that just need that little nudge to get involved, and I thought that might be a really interesting way to do it. We certainly see peer pressure applied both in industry, in other kinds of activities, but I don't really see it applied too much in this sector. So that was one sort of random idea that I thought I'd share with you. Now, every single time I talk, I like to do the rah, 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 let's get motivated, all this kind of stuff. And I have this list of principles that I wrote about activism. There's 7 principles. I'm only going to tell you about the last one and read a quote. The last one deals with all the work that we do. And actually, I had a conversation with Liz about this just yesterday. I think I ruined your taping here. I had a conversation with Liz about this very subject, and it's the fact that when you enjoy doing this work, you do it far more vigorously and aggressively, and you never burn out. And the conversation that Liz and I had was all the political work, you know, the machinations of getting change to happen. We both love that stuff. A lot of people don't. But if you can learn to love this work, learn to love the struggles, then you never burn out, and I think you just can get better and better and better as you go. And I, in my 7 principles of activism, it's rule number 7, and it's 3 words: enjoy the fight. You have to learn to enjoy this work, enjoy making change happen. And if you do, you will be a fantastic long-term activist. And there's a quote I want to read by the great desert writer, Edward Abbey. He wrote Desert Solitaire, The Monkey Wrench Gang, and a bunch of fantastic books that you could read in it. And it relates to enjoying the fight. And some of you may have heard me say this before, but I love it. I read it every day. It's on my computer. So I wanted to finish off by just reading it for you. And I hope you take it to heart, and I hope you, if you don't already, learn to enjoy the fight. So here's what Edward Abbey said: do not burn yourselves out. Be as I am, a reluctant enthusiast, a part-time crusader, a half-hearted fanatic. Save the other half of yourselves and your lives for pleasure and adventure. It is not enough to fight for the land. It is even more important to enjoy it while you can, while it's still here. So get out there and hunt, not that we would, and fish and mess around with your friends. Ramble out yonder and explore the forests, climb the mountains, bag the peaks, run the rivers, breathe deep of that yet sweet and lucid air. Sit quietly for a while and contemplate that precious stillness, that lovely, mysterious, and awesome space. Enjoy yourselves, keep your brain in your head and your head firmly attached to your body, the body active and alive. And I promise you this much. I promise you this one sweet victory over our enemies, over those desk-bound men and women with their hearts in a safe deposit box and their eyes hypnotized by desk calculators. I promise you this, you will outlive the bastards. So never give up. Thanks.
One question. I think we probably have time for maybe a question for Rob. But no, I mean, you can cover your time period any way you want, and he certainly said a lot of provocative things. So if there's one thing that anybody would like to ask at this point, and again, there will be lots of opportunity afterward to talk generally to everybody. I think Leah's just going to head where she saw the first hand. So I think if you don't mind holding your question for afterward, that'll be great.
Thanks, Rob. That was amazing. I do go out on the streets and hunt. I hunt for the people who are wearing fur on the streets. And just to give a shout out to activism on the streets, Zip Off the Cruelty is a thing. We have leaflets where people can actually approach people on the street. I know everyone is concerned in the winter, it's thoroughly depressing. But feel as though you can approach people, empower yourselves to speak up to those that are wearing fur. And Rob, there's a list of events that people can look at animalrightstoronto.com or Animal Rights on Facebook. You can submit events if you know there's a vegan animal rights event happening, then please submit events and then everyone can attend.
One more?
Hi there. I'm sorry, I've never heard of your organization. I'm sure you've done some amazing work in the 40 years that you have. I wonder if anybody has actually done any outreach to schools, develop people young, and help children relate to how this movement has to do with their survival, how they eat.
Yes, actually, most of the groups that I'm aware of, ranging from the smaller groups to the larger international groups, have outreach programs, some of them that are very involved, that have curriculum lesson plans for every grade. You know, there are many like that, and there are others that do it on a more sort of opportunistic basis, where they will try to take advantage of opportunities going out into schools to talk about particular issues. In the case of my organization, it's opportunistic largely. Most of the outreach to children occurs through our campaigns. So I can give you, you know, an example where we were doing a campaign throughout the North, and as part of that campaign, we wanted to get kids on board, so we would go into schools and talk about that particular issue to school kids. I was involved in another project dealing with stray dogs in the Cree communities in northern Quebec. So part of that project was humane education in every one of the schools in all of the Cree towns that we were dealing with. But most of the organizations that I'm aware of or that I've worked with, they do that kind of work. Some of them are dedicated solely to that, like the Kindness Club, which operated for many, many years. That's all they did, go into schools. But there are many groups that do that either in a small way or in a more substantive way. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Again,
thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. Thanks. That was great. And some people's job is to be the spoiler and cut things off and keep it moving along. But as I said, this is has been organized in a way that is both social and kind of more structural, so that don't be hesitant when we're finished with the formal presentations to you know, pose those questions that you didn't get a chance yet to pose. And we're going to go into the law now, and with Lesli Bisgould, who has a deep history with animal law and with pretty much everybody in this room who is connected to animal protection. I would say she is a true pioneer in animal law because she was the first lawyer in Canada to have a solely animal rights practice, which she had for 10 years. And she has now moved on to full-time legal aid work in poverty and human rights law, but maintains a great and deep involvement in the animal advancement of animal issues. She teaches a wonderful seminar that I've had the pleasure of attending at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. It's an introduction to animal law. And she's also helped organizations with writing legal reports and opinions, groups like the Animal Alliance, Zoocheck, and others. She's lectured on animal rights and the law and authored a book which is the first and now classic Canadian law text on animal law called Introduction to Animals and the Law, or is it just Animals and the Law? The latter? Okay, Animals and the Law. The course is Introduction to Animals and the Law, but yes, and the book is Animals and the Law, and she is in the process of revising it now. But it's an amazing text that covers an incredible amount of every aspect of animal life, which is bound up with the law, which is an amazing number of things to do with animals have also to do with the law. But Lesli, for all of this, is formidable, but she's approachable, she's a clear thinker, she's a wonderful speaker, she's witty and kind and caring. If she ever needs a personal ad written, I will happily volunteer to do that. But meanwhile, it is my pleasure to introduce Lesli Bisgould, and she will talk about animals in research and the law. Here's Lesli.
That's a lot of pressure, actually, to live up to. I don't know about that, but the affection is mutual. So hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see you here and to see that everybody made it out on this snowy Sunday. And I'm really glad to be here among this wonderful group of people. So as you know, when you're talking about the terrible things that humans do to animals, there are so many different topics to choose from. We can talk about animals in agriculture, or there are hunting and trapping and other wildlife issues, circuses, it's endless. But Troy, who's speaking after me, and I are both going to talk about animals in research today. And here's a strange thing to say. I love to talk about animals in research. Not the substantive, violent part of it, but the ethical part. And the reason I love to talk about it is because the use of animals in research is the topic, I think, that best illustrates the problem with categorizing animals as property or chattels or legal things, as we do in our legal system. Because in this subject area, hurting animals is the very purpose of the activity. And so it shows, contrary to the claims of all of those who hurt animals for profit, how it is perfectly lawful all across this country to cause animals pain, suffering, injury, disability, disease, fear, stress, discomfort, loneliness, hunger, thirst, completely unnatural lives. Research is also interesting because it's the most challenging subject for some people who have ethical concerns about the treatment of animals, right? And I'm sure people in this room have experienced that if you've thought about it yourself or tried talking to others about it. We see animals, the use of animals in research, or many people see it as sort of an unfortunate necessity, right? We don't want to do it, but how can we leave any stone unturned when it comes to seeking to cure the diseases that so deeply affect us and the people that we love? How can we leave any stone unturned? Yet, when scrutinized, this subject area really raises what I think are the most difficult problems in respect of justifying the instrumental use of animals. So, in my few minutes this afternoon, I'm going to try and touch on two things. I'm going to say just a few words about what I think are the ethical problems inherent in using animals in research, in general, and then I'm going to touch on Animal Alliance's campaign to stop the use of former pets in research in particular. So the inherent ethical problems, just afraid I'm going to drop this, sorry. Animals are used, as many of you will know, in a wide range of experiments conducted in or by both public and private institutions across this country, universities, hospitals, governments, pharmaceutical, and other corporations. And although humans would be, of course, the best models for studies related to human disease and matters generally affecting the human body, ethical concerns preclude the use of unconsenting humans in experiments. And when it comes to the use of consenting humans in experiments, really that's prohibited for the kinds of things that are done to animals. And where it is permitted, it's subject to controls and extensive, deep, persistent ethical debate. In fact, law professor Von Black has written a really great piece about all the criminal offenses that you would be charged with if you did to humans what we do to animals in research. So it's really therefore incorrect to say that we will leave no stone unturned when we are on this quest to cure human disease, right? Because however important such cures are, we've decided as a society that some things are even more important, right? An individual's right, the right that each and every one of us in this room has to our own life, liberty, and bodily integrity is seen as more important and takes priority over the knowledge that might be gained if any of us in this room were used instrumentally for the benefit of others. And when we turn to animals to be the surrogate models for the human body, we create a very interesting logical contradiction. So, research is done on animals on the basis that they are like us, right? And that means the results of the experiments that we do on them are going to be meaningful to us, to the human body. So animals must be like us. But on the other hand, it's justified on the basis that they're not like us. And therefore, there's no ethical concern, right? How convenient. They're like us, they're not like us. They're like us, they're not like us. And that contradiction is an inherent premise of the practice. The researchers can't get around that. And it's also the basis, of course, of much of the objection to it. However, that contradiction is really, as you will have seen, obscured in the public realm, right? For lots of reasons. We see the research industry very sophisticated in this way, emphasizing the very serious problems that it promises to solve. And so it perpetuates this idea that vivisection, the use of live animals in research, is this unfortunate necessity. At the same time, it assures the public of the humane care that it's providing to the animals, how much it loves the animals that it uses, and then it portrays its critics, all of you in this room, as emotional and soft and little bunny huggers, or militant and terrorist extremists, or both, I don't know. Somehow we can be all of these things. And in these ways, it's been really successful at deflecting widespread public scrutiny. So I invite you to just take a wee moment to think about these claims. So first, the categorization of the use of animals in experiments as an unfortunate necessity. That is not just a factual assertion, is it? That's a moral assertion. And the practice is often framed this way, right? It's like a choice between killing an animal or letting a person die, right? They make you feel silly. How could you care about being mean to mice when we're talking about curing childhood leukemia? But this, of course, is an incredibly simplistic reduction of the scientific process itself. But it's also misleading from an ethical perspective, because the choice so posed has already been made, right? What I mean by that is the act of considering whether taking one life will save another reduces the status of the first to a mere instrument, right? We would never speak of the necessity of using a human being in an experiment without their consent, or taking a human being's organs to be transplanted into another person without their consent, or when we hear of such things happening in other parts of the world, we speak of it with condemnation. So characterizing the practice as an unfortunate necessity really presupposes and accepts that animals have a categorically different moral status than humans. Second, this humane promise that the industry makes. If a procedure is too terrible to subject a human to, how does it become humane when you subject an animal to it? How does that magic transformation happen? Only if in law, and only if that vague word has no actual meaning. And in law, as far as I know, it actually has no meaning. We throw around the word humane, but I can't find it in any legislation with respect to animals. So without having to explain what they mean, the industry throws this term around, as you know, just as a squishy way of allaying any concern that the lay public might have. It's all humane, it's all humane. When you talk to people who are wearing, like Jenny suggested, talking to people wearing fur, when you encounter them in public, they've all been assured by Canada Goose that it's all humane. What does humane mean? What's the law requiring it to be humane? Oh, we never asked that second question, and they never have to answer it. And so when the industry just makes these vague assurances that everything's pretty and humane, most people who are busy with 1,000 problems in their lives don't have time and feel they don't actually have to think about what is going on behind those very tightly closed doors. But even if we did want to think about it, information about what exactly is being done to animals and for what reason is very carefully withheld from you and from all of us in this room. There is no legal duty on researchers or any agency to make that information publicly available. And when it's sought by Freedom of Information requests, disclosure is opposed by the research institutions. It's opposed by the CCAC, the Canadian Council on Animal Care, which is the national voluntary organization that's responsible for setting and maintaining and overseeing the implementation of standards for animal ethics and care in research across the country. We have no federal laws governing it. And then when any disclosure is actually made, it's very heavily redacted, right? Covered with black lines so that you can't read what's there. So with scientists seen as what Charlotte Montgomery called the miracle workers of the secular age, deference is completely given to the industry to determine what is necessary and humane and to decide completely for itself what is acceptable practice. Now, Ontario is the only province in Canada that has legislation specifically dedicated to animals and research, and it's called the Animals for Research Act. But that legislation gives hardly any consideration to the interests of the animals themselves. And this is particularly troubling when we consider that this is a competitive multi-billion-dollar industry, or industries. Even the research subjects themselves are bred and sold by large corporations with their own very profitable patent-protected strains of animals who are selectively bred to be susceptible to certain types of cancers or seizures or having Alzheimer's, as we're hearing in the news recently. And they call these animals purpose-bred. When it comes to cats and dogs, many who are used in Canadian, or at least we know for sure in Ontario labs, are former pets. As the Julie, I believe it was a person back asked about earlier. The purpose-bred animals surely do not deserve to be used in research, but there's something about using lost or stolen or even unwanted pets in this way that seems a particular violation of trust. Now, of course, the industry doesn't call these animals pets, but more clinically random source. These are random source animals. And rather than protect these animals, the Animals for Research Act creates the only system in the country of pound seizure, which effectively requires municipalities or municipal pounds to turn their unclaimed animals over to an interested research facility if they are not claimed within 72 hours. So this brings me to Animal Alliance's campaign to stop the use of former pets in research. Now, they had a campaign to end the use of animals in research in general and pets in particular for many years, and it was very successful in reducing the number of animals being used. However, those numbers are rising again, and Animal Alliance is ramping up the campaign again. They've begun by undertaking a major research project to get a clear picture of the problem. And so what I'm talking to you about here is information that I've gotten from a presentation done by Liz, and that's been written about, at least I think in a draft report that I stole from in this presentation by Erika, who may recognize it as familiar, so I quote her now. If you think it sounds good, thank her. So what they've looked at is data published by the CCAC. There's lots to say, by the way, about the information given to us by the CCAC. That's a long digression. I'm going to resist the temptation, but if you're interested in the question period. They also looked at research facility animal use and instruction documents, inspection reports of research facilities in pounds produced by OMAFRA, which is the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, who oversees the Animals for Research Act. And they've looked at municipal pet dog and cat bylaws in 107 so far of the 440 municipalities in Ontario. So, all research facilities in Ontario have to be registered with OMAFRA, and they are subject to inspection pursuant to the Animals for Research Act. But when I last looked into it, when I was writing my book, I actually spoke to the chief inspector, who was the chief inspector of himself, because it turns out there are 120 locations, at least, he thought at the time, where animals were being used in research in Ontario, because some facilities have several sites around the province. So at least 120 locations and one inspector. Do the math. I wonder if Doug Ford is going to hire more. So research facilities can also be assessed by the CCAC to see if they're implementing CCAC guidelines. And any facility that's getting public research dollars has to be certified by CCAC to get that funding. But facilities that are receiving private money and private pharmaceutical corporations do not. So that means there's a lot we don't know. We don't know how many facilities are registered with the CCAC, how many aren't. We don't know whether private facilities outside Ontario acquire cats and dogs as former pets for research. The animals used in those facilities would not be included in the CCAC data. But what do we know? Well, we know that in the terrible 80s, between 1980 and 1989, both purpose-bred and random source dogs and cats were used in registered research facilities across Ontario. And in fact, in those days, the majority was random source. And on average, 3,977 pets were used in research every year in the 80s. But as you heard, the Toronto Humane Society was a strong, active organization in those early 80s, and then along came Animal Alliance, and during their campaigns, there was a major decline in the use of all dogs and cats for research in Ontario. And the average number of pets in research between, now jumping ahead to the new millennium, 2003 and 2011, from almost 4,000 had gone down now to 642. Terrible for those 642, but what a dramatic decline. But the numbers began to increase again in 2013. And since that time, the average number of pets, just pets, by the way, a tiny fraction of the whole, pets in research every year is now over 4,700. So we've gone beyond even the terrible 80s. So what happened to drive these numbers up? Animal Alliance has a theory which has to do with the change in a definition of the term donated by owner in the instruction form that research facilities have to fill out. I'm going to leave it at that. If you want to talk some more about that in the question period, we can do that. But what's clear is that both the animal use reports from research institutions and OMAFRA's research facility inspection reports show dogs and cats going to research from pounds, as we know because the law requires it, but also from shelters, from humane societies, from rescue groups, and the public is not allowed to know which ones. So what else has Animal Alliance learned through the Freedom of Information process? Well, secrecy persists. So much is withheld. The names of institutions, the species of animals, the description of what is actually done to them in the course of the experiment. But between 2012 and 2017, they found 26 inspection reports where dogs and cats were used, and in 16 of those, more than half, for people who don't want to do math on a snowy Sunday afternoon, more than half of these were in non-compliance with the Animals for Research Act. OMAFRA provided a list of 67 Ontario registered research facilities in 2016. 30% of the names were withheld. Of the 67 facilities, approximately 20 were using dogs and cats in research, and of those, approximately 11 were using pets. And even heavily redacted, those reports show problems in how the animals are housed and handled. They cite numerous violations of standard operating procedures. Almost all of them show deficiencies in sanitation, inadequacy of design of housing, low standard of living conditions, lack of safety. Some are using expired drugs, including anesthetics and pain relievers. Some document injury to animals through faulty equipment and rundown facilities. Many instances of human failure to protect dogs and cats in their care from other animals who may be vicious or dangerously ill or terrified. Failure to provide adequate veterinary care or proper oversight. Various reports cite dogs housed in small rusty cages where the lights are never turned off. You hear constant barking, but you can't see the other animals. I was actually in a facility like that, where the humans don't come on the weekend. They're not fed, they're not given anesthetic, their cages aren't clean. I don't work on Sundays. And there are specific examples. One where, I won't go over all of them, the inspector writes, intervention action to be taken for dogs that were experiencing severe pain was not included. Types and dosages of analgesics, not even mentioned. One lab had no standard operating procedure to ensure consistent, regular involvement of veterinary staff. Another lacked requirements for regular veterinary care, sloppy practices in terms of open feed. One report noted serious consideration should be given to providing experience in current anesthetic strategies for students, despite this being a terminal procedure. Read between the lines. One report noted, I was informed there was an outbreak of feline panleukopenia in the cat room. There was no opportunity to isolate the infected cats as there wasn't a quarantine room in the facility and some had to be euthanized. There's much more. And I'll steal Erika's, or I hope I'm not stealing Erika's thunder by sharing with you an observation that I read in her report. If we know all of this from such heavily redacted reports, what are those thick black lines covering? So, to finish, thanks to the Animal Alliance's work and other advocacy organizations who've been supporting them over decades, many municipalities in Ontario, as you heard Liz say earlier, including Toronto, London, other urban centers, have opted not to turn their animals over to research, keeping unclaimed pets for as long as necessary to return them home or to try and adopt them out. Some call Animal Alliance's Project Jessie to come out. They have even a relationship. Hey, we come and get a couple of guys, and Animal Alliance will send somebody out, the Project Jessie, to rescue those animals and try and find homes for them. But others, and they're often smaller centers, rural centers, they lack funds, they lack public support, they lack paid personnel to provide shelter or care for stray animals. They lack the nerve, maybe, to defy provincial law. And then the contracts for animal collection will often go to private operators, and the ones who are in it for the money are very happy to get the few bucks they get for selling animals to research. In some cases, as Liz already mentioned, there are no municipal bylaws in place, so they're hearing stories of people sometimes posing as Humane Society officials, driving around, picking up strays, stealing them from doorsteps. This is a very common practice. That's what motivated the passage of the Animals for Research Act back in the 70s in the first place. Not concern about what was happening to animals in labs, concern about pets that were being stolen and used in research. So the goal now, again, that Animal Alliance is striking back up is to amend the law to stop the sale of pets to research. And I want to thank all of you for who are in this room for supporting them in that work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. And there is opportunity for several questions. And so Leah will, again, go to whoever she sees first. Great, I didn't use mine.
Use your report. It was great.
I was just curious, so Liz had mentioned like the bylaw that Toronto passed so that they wouldn't have to hand their animals over. So if you were saying that the provincial legislation says that they must, how is Toronto able to do that?
I think if I'm getting this right, it's not that they've passed a better law, it's just they're justifying it. They're just not doing it. And they haven't gotten into any trouble, yeah. It's not necessarily an issue people want to take on. I'm not sure the research industry wants to draw attention to the fact that they're coming for your pets. So it's kind of interesting, you know, the places who have had the nerve to do it haven't seen any challenges as far as I know. And you could pass a bylaw. A lawful way of doing it, I think, is that you could pass a bylaw requiring, saying that your municipality is going to hold on to pets for a longer time, let's say 6 months. You have the option of passing, I believe you have the option of passing a bylaw saying that your municipality is going to do that.
Sorry, but we're just trying to, because the light is coming in and reflecting off the building. We're just trying to, sorry, didn't mean to.
Hi there. Very interesting. You know, evidently, I, like everyone here, are against animal research. And we know it exists. I learned years ago, University of Toronto, weekly do experiments on animals. I saw the building, but it's not the fact here. What options exist though? They can't experiment on animals. I'm against it, but to you, I pose the question, what options exist? Before you answer as well, I'll tell you, I listened to Keita's town hall meeting, and Ingrid Newkirk was speaking the other day, and was claiming that there was a lot of changes, like Sue and Chew, animal research, and that in particular, I recall hearing Japan and South Korea had finally, after many years, Keita was trying to pass and change experimentation on dogs, like cultivating dogs and such, for research purposes and so on. We have agreed not to do that anymore, and that a myriad of companies, I think she was saying, or someone else in the town hall meeting, that you could tune in through your phone and so forth, that back in the 80s, there was like 3 to 5 companies that used to advertise, say, ban animal testing on their products, and now today there's over 3,000 or 4,000 or something of that nature. But frankly, what options are there to not test on animals?
Well, so thank you for the question. And in some ways, while I said I love to talk about animals for research, it's also a difficult topic to do in a short time, because to do justice to your question is a lecture unto itself. But perhaps a short way of answering is to say, how are we going to grow cotton in the southern United States without slaves? How are we going to run our trains across Canada without Chinese slaves to build the tracks for us? So we get so used, there's a process of normalization where we see things happening and we think this is the way it has to be done, but why does that make it okay? Just because we do it that way. So we might ask, how are we ever going to find the cures to human disease if we don't experiment on humans? And people would say, what? That's horrifying. Of course we wouldn't experiment on humans. Oh, okay. Well, so if we've already now acknowledged, we're not going to use the best group possible, what are the criteria for determining what is acceptable? So people get used to doing it because we've always done it this way, but that doesn't mean it's justifiable. And there's a more scientific answer too, which I'm not qualified to give, but I can say there is mounting scientific evidence from very reputable research institutions with respect to cancer, with respect to heart disease, and many of the leading killers that say not only is animal research not effective, but that it's actually deceptive. Because while we are similar to other animals in many ways, of course, we're also different in many ways, so that the results of what we're learning isn't necessarily applicable. And by the way, the researchers say this at the end of all of their papers, that it's not necessarily applicable. There is a growing and a huge already body of evidence in respect of products that were tested on animals and found to be safe, but then became problematic when used on people, or found to be unsafe, and then so we shouldn't assume that just because we've always done it, it's justifiable to continue to do it. And the truth is that now that more and more people are starting to see it that way and ask questions, miracle upon miracle, the industry is finding there are all sorts of alternatives that they can use, whether it's with computers or actually Troy, who's going to speak now, is probably in a much better position to elaborate on this than I am, because he's more familiar with, up to date on some of this stuff. So maybe if it's okay, I'll cut it off here and defer to him to pick it up. Thank you. And that's not even the best answer. Let me think about it. We'll try again over coffee.
What industries now, in particular, are still
doing animal testing? So is it like, you naturally think cosmetics, things that, I don't know, but it could be universities, like, I went to university, well, I know they don't do that.
They all do it. All the universities are doing it. All the hospitals are doing it. Every product is tested on animals, unless, I shouldn't be so callous about it, because as I'm sure everybody knows, there are all sorts of alternative brands and products who have sprung up now. It's becoming a giant industry unto it, or a much bigger industry unto itself. So there's obviously plenty of profitable ways of creating these products without testing on animals, but all the big, I'm generalizing here, almost all of the huge corporations still do it for their cosmetics, for their household products, for things you wouldn't even imagine, anything that has chemistry in it. If that's well, that's not a good way of,
Right.
never mind. Cut that last line, she said, yeah.
Lots of the cosmetic companies have stock.
Pardon me?
Cosmetic companies, several have stock.
Some companies
When
definitely
they
have
sort
stock.
that out somewhere else, say they don't do it, they're saying that they don't have stock. But
Right.
what other things, like, we're the ones hiding that we can't access, what are they researching? Where are they from? Are they Canadian companies?
There's Canadian companies, American companies. I mean, any household products, if you think of all the poisons that are sold in grocery stores to clean your home with, that, by the way, we're starting to realize how sick they're making people, all of those are tested on animals. Liquid paper, tape, glue, anything you can think of. If they're coming from major corporations and not the alternative corporations, then they were tested on animals. But I guess I do want to emphasize that lots of corporations are finding ways to do it without using animals. It can be done. It's just that the larger corporations can't be bothered. They don't want to switch gears. They don't want to change the way they've been doing it forever. They've already got the equipment. They've already got personnel. This is how they know how to do it, and they want to continue.
Can you just speak quickly on what the cosmetic ban on animals in Canada means? Because that wasn't that a law that was passed about a year ago or something, and have companies complied? Is that actually, just if you know anything about that, if you could speak on that.
Well, thank you very much for that question. That's a perfect segue to Troy's presentation. That's exactly what he's talking about. So I'll turn it over. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a great segue, and there are all kinds of aspects of this that Troy will cover. This is the kind of person whose resume alone could scare you to death, because for more than 2 decades, which I guess would be since infancy, judging from looking at him, Troy has worked in biomedical and toxicological science policy, animal protection, to advance modern human-focused methods of disease treatment and prevention in place of animal models, which we've already discussed a bit. He's the Vice President on Research and Toxicology at the Humane Society International. He leads a global team of campaigners and lobbyists and scientists who work to end animal testing for cosmetics, including in Canada, where he's been instrumental in getting a proposed cosmetics animal testing ban bill through the Senate, and it's through the Senate now, and soon, hopefully, through the House of Commons, and Troy will certainly make some mention of this, which leads off the last question that we had. And additionally, he served on many committees around the world, including the European Union, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the New Zealand Ministry of Health, and of course here in Canada. Yes, he is a scary guy, but only animal abusers need to be afraid, very afraid of Troy, and the rest of us will simply applaud him. Welcome.
All right, bear with me for one moment. You would like my presentation less without AV assistance, so thank you all again for the invitation to be here. It's great to see so many familiar faces and a lot of new people as well. So it's and also great to follow Lesli, who's done such an excellent job in introducing a very dense and complicated subject. So I'm going to skim over some of the historical background, but I think if we dial the clock back to the the mid-1800s is when animal experimentation began, and Lesli articulated the ethical opposition to that, which sprang up pretty much at the same time that they began vivisecting or live dissecting animals in the town square, no pain relief. This is the earliest beginnings of animal experiments, and there's always been an ethical opposition and an anti-vivisection movement for as long as this industry, this activity has existed. If we dial forward now to the mid-1950s, another school of thought began to appear, which is the scientific case, to say, mice are not little humans with tails. We're different species, and an extremely hard-line scientific argument began to be articulated, saying, the use of the word scientific fraud has been used. And then a third school of thought also emerged in 1959, a response from the scientific community itself, and the principle of the 3 Rs, to reduce, to refine, and ultimately replace the use of animals in science, was also articulated. And it doesn't really matter which of those resonates with you, because I think if we look at this in the Canadian context and look at the straight numbers, the statistics on animal use from 1979 until a couple of years ago, you don't need to be a statistician to see the trend line is going up, not down. And although these are summary numbers, they don't capture some of the victories that Liz and Lesli have pointed out. On the whole, we're not winning, and the animals are not winning. And this is despite the 60th anniversary of the 3R principle from the scientific community. I think if you go to any institution, U of T, U of Guelph, and ask scientists, do you support alternatives? Do you support the 3Rs? Everybody does. And yet, why is that the line going up and not down? This is also, CCAC, which Lesli introduced, has been around since 1968, decades. 50th anniversary of this institution, which is supposed to be enforcing the 3R principle through Canada. Again, the proof is in the pudding. So I hate to start on a bit of a downer, but I think we need to be realistic about where we are in the state of play. I entered the world in 1975 and the animal protection space in the early 1990s. And again, you can see there have been dips in the numbers, but overall, they're going up. And it's really forced me, as Rob suggested, to take a step back and really scrutinize, are we just doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result? And are we doing a disservice to the animals in so doing? I don't know whether Einstein actually said this. This is a Google image, but whether or not that's the case, some wise person did point this out, and I think we do need to take that to heart. I don't know if you can see a buzzword that's going around the internet these days a lot is it's time to think outside the cage. Researchers stop equating animals to humans, but I think we in the advocacy community really need to take a good hard look at, again, as Rob said, our activities, our strategies actually working? And if they're not, we need to course correct. Another concept that gets thrown around a lot is evolution versus revolution. So if we look at the 3Rs as an evolutionary concept, we tweak individual experimental proposals in the hope that we'll get to replacement one day. So replacing, an animal test with an alternative in the idea that a one-to-one substitution is necessarily going to work. I'm afraid the reality is much more complex than that. And I think if we look backwards at another animal practice from the 1800s, which is one of the founding issues of the modern humane movement, it was anti-vivisection and carriage horse welfare. Those are the two issues that founded most SPCAs in history. And there's been a century of history of advocacy that these animals are horribly treated. We need to modify how we behave towards them, how long they can be made to work, the welfare standards that are provided to these animals. But the number one thing that actually addressed this issue, mostly once and for all, is the invention of the automobile. Coming up with a better alternative, a revolutionary way to address a human need. And if we view animal research, animal testing through the same lens, as Lesli said, it's the wrong thing, but for an acceptable reason. Curing disease is not selfish. There's nothing wrong with that. But can we have a better tool that will be more effective than pretending that rats and mice are miniature people? By the same token, if we wanted to go to Vancouver today, we could drive 45 hours, I suppose, in the automobile, or use the latest innovations. And say what you will about Air Canada service and food quality, we're going to take the plane because we like shiny new things. Every other aspect of our society is embracing hungrily the latest technologies, the latest innovation. Why are we still dealing with animal model principles from the 1800s? What's wrong with this picture that this is the one area in our lives that is so firmly entrenched in the past? I hope you're going to be able to see these next couple of slides, but I think it's important to really understand the problem and understand the language that we use. We tend to use animal research and animal testing interchangeably, but they're different animals. So if we begin with testing, one of the questions to Lesli was, what's animal tested? Can you give me a list? It could be pharmaceuticals, it could be vaccines, industrial chemicals, food additives, pesticides. They're all animal tested. Why? It's the law is the short answer in most cases. Before marketing a product under Canadian, European, American, Chinese, everywhere, legislation, companies are required by government authorities to submit test data to substantiate, is it safe? Is it effective? Those are reasonable questions because we all, when we go down the supermarket aisles and we pick something up, we assume it's going to be safe. We don't ask ourselves, how do we know that? What goes into that evidence of safety? Depending on the kind of product and the particular piece of legislation, there could be a long list of testing requirements. It could be, you may be familiar with the LD50, the lethal dose 50% test. They have oral skin exposure, forced inhalation variants of that test. Eye and skin irritation, skin allergy, does it cause cancer, birth defects? There's a long, often tick the box list. And this is just in Canada. Then we have to consider that we're living in an age of global trade. So it's not just Canada. If I'm a company and I want to sell any new chemical, I have to consider what are all of the laws and regulations in every country where I want to sell this thing. And if we have an alternative method, say a skin model that uses human 3D tissue instead of blinding a rabbit, if that is accepted in all but one major market, and I want to sell in that market, that country, guess what? I'm still doing the rabbit test because I have to follow the law or choose not to sell in that country. And multinationals don't become multinationals by going down on the other side of that issue. So the reality is these companies are following legal requirements which are extremely complicated and tick at least a dozen major national sets of regulations. So that's why everything is animal tested and why it takes bloody forever to change it. The other scenario is research, and that could be fundamental research. What does this enzyme do in biology? Or I would like to understand cancer, HIV, looking at a particular medical application. And here's a very different story. There is no law anywhere that says, in order to investigate these things, you must use animals. What happens is there's a group of organizations. It could be a government funding agency. It could be a charity like the Heart and Stroke Foundation. It could be the Gates Foundation. Someone with money decides, I'm going to allocate this money to a particular purpose, and they determine the eligibility. So they could say, I've got $100 million, I'd like to look at lung cancer, and they publish that to the universe of scientists, and they will decide, if they don't specify, I could be looking at improving animal models, or I could be looking at human tissue on a chip. And if I'm a funding agency, I could put brackets around my funding and say, no, I want $100 million for a human-based approach. Or I want 100 million, we've mapped the human genome, knock some genes out of mice, see what happens. So these scientists, U of T, wherever, they're hungry. They survive based on grant funding. So they're going to be reading these grant applications and preparing proposals. And depending on, again, going back to the beginning, what are the parameters, what are the criteria that the funding bodies set is going to dictate fork in the road. If I am deciding I want to do an animal type of study, I'm going to do a proposal. It's going to go to my local institutional animal care committee to judge the ethics of it. If it follows a peer review and I'm successful in getting funding, rubber stamp, dead animals. Or alternatively, if you go down the human-based track, everything downstream from that doesn't happen, and you're able to develop a human biology-based approach to addressing a human health concern. So that's just kind of a wordy way of saying a lot of what Lesli was talking about is at the right-hand side of that flow diagram. And historically, whether we're talking about the CCAC, confidentiality, access to information, all of that is happening very late in the process. I would argue too late to really make a meaningful difference on a large scale. If we can move the money and set different parameters, and think about it, if you're donating to a charity, if every person who made a donation, I won't name charities, but made it clear that they will not accept their charitable donations being used for any of that downstream animal use, guess what's going to happen? So we can make a tremendous impact at a very critical stage in the process. Looking at, back to the toxicology, the animal testing space, how do we achieve replacement in practice? And I'm glad one of the questions came up talking about the one-year dog test, which is something that HSI has been working on as well. The scientific evidence that this test, where beagle dogs, 36 per test, are broken into 4 groups, and they are either force-fed or their food is laced with the pesticide chemical for 1 year. And then at the end of the test, they're killed, dissected. It's basically a fishing expedition to see what this pesticide did to their insides. This test was declared scientifically meaningless by regulatory scientists who would know back in the late 1990s. In 2007, the US removed it as a requirement, and in over a decade later, we got the European Union, India, Canada. Last year, Japan and South Korea finally took it off the books. Brazil is the last holdout. So we actually have a situation with a company we're talking to now, which has been at the forefront of helping us get this test taken off the books. And they feel they're not able to do business in Brazil because the government is still requiring legally this one test. So it's that one holdout country is a barrier, and it's not just a barrier to one company. So how do we deal with this? I mean, this has been a 20-year process to remove one scientifically needless animal test, and there are dozens of animal tests across different regulatory frameworks across 200 countries in the world. We need a much more efficient way of getting through this. The solution that HSI is working on is what we call mandatory alternatives laws, and it's predicated on a European model from 1986, which is sort of, it's taking the 3 R's and making it law to say, if an alternative approach is reasonably available, thou shalt not conduct an animal experiment. So you establish across the board, it doesn't matter whether it's a drug, a pesticide, cosmetic, chemical, if there is an alternative approach, the regulators must accept the alternative. And we've been successful in 2014 in having that measure taken up in Brazil, together with a 5-year mandatory phase-out for the animal test that is replaceable. A couple of years ago in the United States, we were able to amend the federal chemical law, and this deals with 100,000 chemicals per year, to require very strong animal protective language to be adopted by the US EPA and by the industry. And in South Korea, back in 2017, we were able to do the same thing with their legislation. So it's a slow process, but as we're covering these major countries whose decisions really make an impact on millions, if not tens of millions of animals every year, we're able to go in a fundamental way and hopefully dramatically accelerate the process of using alternatives. Back to Canada, cosmetics, another question that came up. This has been a long thought campaign going back to the 1970s, long before my time. But after the European Union became the largest cruelty-free beauty market, meaning banning animal testing for cosmetics, as well as the sale of cosmetics that have been subject to any new animal testing after 2013, we have seen the floodgates open, and it's by having the luxury of I have a team around the world. So I have people in Korea, Japan, China, and elsewhere. So we've been able to get 37 national bans to date, and by we, I include other organizations who also work in this space. There are 8 state bans, and we have 10 similar laws that are working their way through the legal process as we speak, Canada being one of them. So where are we with the Cruelty-Free Cosmetics Act? It cleared our federal Senate in June. It is pending reintroduction for first reading before the House of Commons. Hopefully, cross your fingers, the next week or two, we will see that. HSI and Animal Alliance have been working in lockstep on this since the beginning, and we're working to really try and negotiate with the major beauty companies and the industry position to get agreement on what the language they can live with, so that we will hopefully see this move very quickly through the legislative process. Because as you know, we have an election this year, so at the end of June, if this hasn't been through the full 3 readings and up to royal assent, we get knocked back. So I can't overstate the urgency here. I'm optimistic we're going to get there, but we really are counting on each and every one of our supporters to get on the phone, get on email to your member of parliament, and really rock the boat. So I'm going to pivot quickly to a little more science, because as Lesli pointed out, however you feel about animal protection, animal rights, the ethics, there's also the scientific reality that around 95% of new drugs that appear safe and effective in animal tests wind up being unsafe or ineffective when they're given to humans. So this, you can see the bars are the amount of money that the number of new drugs approved. The cost is the straight line. Fewer new drugs approved, higher costs. The model isn't working, and the industry itself knows it. And by the numbers, we're talking about $2.5 billion for every new drug candidate. That takes around 13 and a half years on average to come to market in thousands of animals. And these are drug companies who gave this quote. Most of this failure is due to the limited predictive value of preclinical, aka animal models. And as much as we focus on the animal piece of it, also being cognizant, going back to Rob's idea of other communities we need to reach out to, we're all family members who are suffering from diseases. We are all not benefiting from this situation. And I think we really need to break out of the your child or your dog kind of polemic that certainly some of the opposition would like us to continue going around that hamster wheel. But the reality is we're all losing, and we need to break out of that. One of the most sort of bang you over the head quotes that I've encountered in recent years is, we've moved away from studying human disease in humans. The problem is it hasn't worked. And it's time we stop dancing around the problem. We need to refocus and adopt new methodologies for use in humans to understand disease in humans. This wise person isn't me, isn't PETA. It's the former director of the US National Institutes of Health, a medical doctor who has spent his entire career working on curing human disease. So this is a high-level recognition that we have a serious problem. What HSI has been doing, we've launched a collaboration called Biomedical Research in the 21st Century, or Biomed 21, and we've been taking this high-level concept and working with scientists who have been, again, career in the trenches, Alzheimer's disease, autism. They're in the labs. This is their life. This is why they get out of bed in the morning. And we've commissioned them to do critical reviews, objective, independent of us, and what is working, what is not working, And I don't have time today to get into the nitty-gritty of what they found, but these people are shredding the preconceived notions within the science community, and they're doing it on a disease-by-disease basis. And we're taking those results and giving them to the charities who are working in these areas and say, excuse me, can we have a conversation? Because this isn't benefiting your interest, your stakeholders either. We've also been working, as our name suggests, internationally, and we've been having workshops with science funding agencies across the globe. We've had Europe, Latin America, North America, and we're looking at Asia Pacific this year to really have focused debates around what can we do differently? How do we not keep doing the same thing again and again? And it's hard to really measure how successful or not successful some of this is, but this is a PowerPoint slide from the European Commission Directorate General for Research. This is the big pot of money for the European Union, 20, soon to be 27 countries. And the way they've broken this down is, I think, quite telling. They're committing to eliminate poorly predictive models in exactly the same diseases that we have handed to them, developing improved models, and specifically replacing animals with better in vitro cell-based or in silico computational tools in exactly these areas. So this is the second largest pot of research money in the world for biomedicine, and they're showing signs of beginning to make that course correction. So again, going back to an earlier question about what are the alternatives. Firstly, I should say I almost never use the word alternative anymore, because what we really, I found using the language of science to talk to scientists is much more effective than leading with the animal card. Because again, these people get out of bed in the morning. I'm a cancer researcher. Avoiding animal use, that's laudable, but that's not my jam. So speaking to them and just taking the same ideas, but reframing, repackaging, rebranding them using a little more scientific lingo has worked wonders in opening doors. So I'm going to be a little geeky here and show you some science pictures, which I find exciting. I hope you do too. But looking at in vitro, again, people think test tube or petri dish, and that's true. That's sort of the old school. We've now, if you look at that little panel on the right, that is what's called a well plate, and that has 1,536 little grooves in it. So think that many test tubes, which no human being, imagine doing that for your daily life. So these robots on the left automatically drop chemicals in. So you can look at a greater number of chemicals, a greater number of dosages, completely automated, work nights and weekends. You don't need to go in and clean cages. So the cost involved in this crashes. The time involved is a fraction of doing an animal test. And the amount of information you get is, you need supercomputers to deal with it because it's information overload. Slightly less efficient, but also much more relevant. We have, if you've heard of organs on a chip, this diagram is from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health in the US, which has invested over $200 million in the past 5 years in this cutting edge, creating a human organ on a chip for key body systems in the human body. This, the top right, is a lung on a chip. So think like a little thumb drive where you have channels for pumping air in and out, so it contracts and expands the way our lungs do when we breathe. And there's a channel for air, there's a channel for blood, and just think if you can study emphysema to lung cancer using this, using human cells that not only sit in a petri dish and get bored and cranky because there's there's nothing to do. Here they have a much more biosimilar kind of environment where you have, oxygen in, waste goes out. It's much more representative of the real world. Here's a little video. This is a blinking eye on a chip from the University of Pittsburgh. And again, that's human cornea eye tissue. The image on the left is a Dray's test, the rabbit test from the 1940s. It's no contest. I mean, this isn't just an animal person saying, oh, we have better alternatives, trust me. You know, this is the largest funding agencies in the world are putting serious bucks into doing this. And this, right now, this is one organ at a time, but the objective is to have an entire human on one of these tiny little chips that have the key body systems, the blood flow, the oxygen flow. This is where we're close. These are not cheap. These are not fast yet. This is new technology, but this is where the science is going, and the ability to completely strip away the extrapolation issue is, I can almost taste it. And finally, when I think about it, when I hear the words animal model, I think black box. You force feed something to a rat, you know, feet up, feet down, you don't really know what happened. But we have decades of medical research information that is published in science journals, which are behind journal firewalls, where you have to pay and you have to, you know, clunkily go through them and read paper by paper. It's really hard to access what do we, you know, as the human species actually know. How do we capture scientific knowledge? And this is a simplified way of saying from the time we're exposed to something, what do we know about what happens within the molecules in our cells, the tissues, the organ, all the way up. And there's a lot of different places where we can get that information, from clinicians to molecular biologists, and different models that I've covered that can be used to test. This is a really oversimplified way of presenting you know, this kind of diagram. Human biology is not simple. If it were, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd have cracked it. It's not as simple as building a car to replace a horse. This is a grand challenge of our time, and this is why we need very sophisticated computers as well. But the opportunity to move away from this one-to-one animal versus alternative kind of thinking, which has never really worked, and be able to put all of these tools together, we're already seeing some of this being used for safety decisions today. Drug companies are at the very bleeding cutting edge of this. They're using it, they're making decisions. It's a matter of mainstreaming it, making sure that laboratories across the world have this kind of capability. And right now, if we look at the top right, the current approach is expensive. It uses 150 million animals per year. It takes a long time, and the relevance of the predictions to you or me is generally quite low. Again, that 95% number from the drug sector. We're not going to get to zero animal use overnight, but we're on the road. And as we move through it, the cost will go down, the human relevance will go up, and our hope and our belief is that animal use will be reduced to zero ultimately. So to summarize, there are sort of two takeaways that HSI has taken on board in terms of how do we tackle this, how do we not do what isn't working and really course correct. And the first, in relation to the testing, is really investing in these mandatory alternatives laws so that as we have these new methods coming on board, hopefully it'll be an automated process where governments just take it and run, rather than we have to, you know, fly to Seoul, fly to Beijing, get them in a headlock and make them, not that we do that, but figurative headlocks. And then the other piece, this is around 10%, I should say, of the body count, is toxicology testing. 85 to 90% is research. The beauty with research is if we can move the money in really big pockets, we don't need to change regulations. We don't, you know, scientists will follow the money wherever it happens to lead. We just have to get better at moving that money. And this takes me back to Liz's presentation around how do we become more relevant? How do we make our voices matter more? And by being politically active is a really key piece. So my takeaway is 3 parts. The first, the easiest, help us ban animal testing for cosmetics in Canada. We have an online petition at becrueltyfree.ca. If you haven't signed it, I encourage you to register to obtain updates from us, because we are entering a hot and heavy period of activity, and your members of parliament need to hear from you. The second, take a stand. The animal research is funded almost exclusively by our money. whether that's our donations or by our tax dollars. And that's, I know, a hard thing to kind of drill into. Charities are easy. Before you make a donation, pick up the phone. You can ask some really pointed questions. You can also reach out to your member of parliament who, you know, that's not going to change the paradigm, it's not going to change the world, but I guarantee they never have anyone call them, email them, write them a letter to ask about this issue. And every time someone does, it's a holy shit moment for them because they don't know what to do. They don't have talking points, they're not prepared. And if everyone in this room reached out to their MP today or tomorrow with those questions, all of this is going to go back to the funding agencies to say, what do we say? We're suddenly getting these questions, what do we do? And just that sensitized activity, and if we can continue to grow that, it is going to make a difference because we have this kind of a schism in our own minds where, it was said earlier, we want treatments for these diseases, we want safe products, we don't want animals to be used, and we need to be challenging that in ourselves, but also in our policymakers and our political officials. And lastly, being a more informed consumer, we're all aware of cruelty-free cosmetics, but how many people are aware that anything that has a germ-killing label claim, whether that's a hand sanitizer or a countertop sanitizer, is legally a pesticide, which means it's not optional animal testing, it is legally required. And that's tip of the iceberg. So the things that we encounter, the things that we buy every day when we go shopping, do we really understand the fine print about the animal testing consequences? Probably not. I don't know why anyone would go looking for that. That's not nice information to have in your brain. But if you go to hsi.org and animal testing, we have fact sheets that will give you some of that fine print. So with that, I will close. Again, all of this change is really incumbent on each of us as individuals and as supporters of Animal Alliance and other animal advocacy organizations. The change that we achieve is all thanks to you. So thank you all for being here.
Well, Joy has answered so much, but of course, every great answer breeds other questions. So we have time probably for maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and then we can break into a general group and ask all the questions we want.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Website. What was that last website?
It's hsi.org/endanimaltesting.
Okay, we have somebody at the mic with a question, I think.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So I'm trying to collect the dots. My name's Audrey Burand. Thank you very much. And what I'm wondering from the last speaker, all this new research on animals, so many more animals being used, is this because these societies, Cancer Society, MS Society, Alzheimer's Society is funding all this? Or from where does the immense amount of animals being tested, the new animals being tested, who is funding this? It must be these societies, that's what I think.
It's a combination of charities, but charities are very small compared to government. It's our tax dollars is number one. Charities or private like Gates and other Wellcome Trust, where specifically the uptick occurs is it's the basic research. It's not the regulatory testing. Those numbers are actually going down because as companies go cruelty-free, et cetera, and the successes that we're all having, it is making an impact to the testing, but the number one thing that's driving the numbers up is genetic engineering of animals. So we've mapped the human genome, we've mapped the mouse genome, and now it's tinker time, where what happens if you stick this gene in a mouse or if you knock this gene out, and it's the breeding to create them, and within that, you create these what are called transgenic or knockout. It's genetically modified, buzzword. But if they develop a strain that they think is interesting, that they'd like to keep around and do things with, it's the stupidest thing. It is the process of having, you've got a room full of these animals, they'll live a year and a half maybe. If you want to keep them around, you keep breeding them. And it's just continuous breeding of genetically interesting animals. In the United Kingdom, which is the only country that breaks down its statistics in a granular enough way for us to know this, 50% of the animals in their labs are just breeding to keep these strains alive. So as much as I am about replacement rather than the other two R's, we could dramatically reduce just a wasteful breed-kill cycle for these animals pretty much overnight if the CCAC and other organizations who claim that they're doing this as part of their jobs would actually get serious about it.
The University of Windsor's opened a program in the last 1 or 2 years it's a Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing. I think it's a program where people can earn degrees and publish research. How much are these working together? Because I understand there's some in other countries as well across America and Europe. Like, how well are they working together, and how close are they to how close are they to being ready to have things to go? Obviously, you put a list of things up, but we're seeing more animals being used as well. So,
good question. The international centers for the validation of alternatives, so Europe, United States, Japan, Korea, Brazil, are the big ones. They're focusing in the toxicology, the testing area, and they work very closely together. There's actually an international umbrella, they call it ICADM, International Council for, anyway, it's where they all sit around the same table and cooperate. So that part of it is good. Canada has ambitions to join that, but right now it's sort of a two-headed creature. It's the Canadian Centre for Alternatives to Animal Methods, which is more academically focused. As you said, the degree program, they're working on animals in education, and then they have an ambition through cooperation with Health Canada to work in the testing and the validation area, but that's not off the ground yet. So the conversations have begun, the ambition and the processes for cooperation are there, but even with everything that's being achieved in the testing area, which is more advanced, that's 10% of the total. So whenever you make progress, it's a little blip relative to the landslide or tsunami effect that you get in the biomedical area, if that makes sense.
Brilliant presentation, thank you. I think one thing that none of the groups have kind of said is, please give us money. I am a monthly donor to HSI, to Zoocheck, and to Animal Alliance. It's one of the easy things I can do. And then each organization can go off and do their fantastic work. But I also want to give a shout out to grassroots activism. I had a chat with Nathaniel Erskine-Smith the other day. He tried to get legislation through. He was kind of disappointed that he couldn't at the federal level. And now he said he's very disappointed that the legal system is coming after the activists. I'm with the group Direct Action Everywhere. I did civil disobedience. I'm now being charged with break and enter and with mischief. I'm expecting a trial this year through the legal system. And I want to give a shout out to all those people on the streets with organizations like Anonymous for the Voiceless, the Save Movement, grassroots activism. And I think it's really important that, that we know that people are speaking up for food animals. All the pigs still languishing in gestation crates and farrowing crates. All the chickens, all the cows, all of them being transported in this weather, minus weather, boiling weather. I think it's really important for all of us to know what we're doing every day. Support the big organizations, but also search out the organizations who are speaking on the streets every day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Again, you can hate me. I'm your replacement model for, because I think at this point, because you've been a wonderful audience for more than 2 hours with fabulous presentations, and there are endless questions that we all could ask. So I think at this point, because we still have an hour and a half to meet, greet, eat, all those things, let's take a break now and set up for the social component of the afternoon. And thanks again. I'd like not only to thank our wonderful speakers, and I appreciate that the previous question asker did that, but I also must thank Leah Lascaris, who has been amazing, not only running around with the microphone, that's only the most recent thing that Leah has done, and Vicki Van Linden and Verena Besso, who helped to make today possible. So thank you so much, and thanks for being here.